Just one decision. Copper prices surged, American businesses staggered, and Canada struck back. On August 1, 2025, when Donald Trump officially imposed a 50% tariff on imported copper, no one expected that a silent metal would become the focal point of a new trade war. The consequences didn't take long to appear. Supply chains broke down, production costs skyrocketed, and America faced the risk of isolating itself from the global trade network. The price of a unilateral strike. No gunshot was fired, no warning was issued beforehand. But just after a cabinet meeting in Washington, the entire American industry shook as if struck by an earthquake. When Donald Trump suddenly announced a 50% tariff on all imported copper, the red metal that quietly underpins all modern technological advances, the U.S. officially entered a trade conflict without drums or trumpets, but one that could leave consequences lasting for decades. With a simple nod and a few repeated words in the meeting room, "We did it with steel, with aluminum, with lumber, and now with copper," Trump turned a strategic industry into the centerpiece of old-style populist economic policy, the same kind that shaped his administration during his first term. But this time, the hand isn't so easy to play, because what's being pulled into this isn't just a metal, but the heart of the modern supply chain. From automobiles to telecommunications, from electricity to chip manufacturing. Less than 24 hours after the tariff order was signed, copper prices on the COMEX exchange spiked 13%, reaching a record $5.95 per pound. That number isn't just a fluctuation on a market chart, it's an alarm bell, the first plume of smoke from a supply chain fire that America itself just ignited. Experts are calling this a self-inflicted shock, a punch in one's own face, and the market reaction is anything but short-term speculation. Unlike steel or aluminum, copper isn't easily replaceable. It's the wiring in every circuit board, the artery of every energy system, the indispensable material for every electric vehicle. Something America is trying to ramp up to escape its dependence on oil. Yet the tariff move runs counter to those very goals. It doesn't expand domestic production, since the U.S. has long lacked copper refining capacity. Nor does it lower prices. On the contrary, it pushes the entire value chain uphill. And worse, it forces once stable and trustworthy partners like Canada to reconsider their strategic relationship. The question isn't just why impose a tariff, but who is it targeting and to what end? The justification of national security, once used in steel tariff cases, is now repeated as a pretext. But in reality, more than 50% of the refined copper consumed in the U.S. comes from imports, mostly from close and stable neighboring countries. There is no national security risk, only the risk from inconsistent policymaking itself. Numbers don't lie. 4.2 billion. That's the market loss recorded just one day after the announcement, but that figure is only the surface. What's collapsing beneath is trust, of investors, of manufacturers, and of international allies, that America still holds steady in its role as the engine of the global supply chain. The tariff strike doesn't hit non-market competitors, but rather the very links that sustain American industry. From wire manufacturers in Indiana to car makers in Michigan, and further to tech startups in California, all are being cornered, not for lack of innovation, but for lack of basic materials, something once assumed to be ever available in an open economy. In that context, American consumers won't remain untouched. They won't see copper prices on trading boards, but they'll feel each ripple. Higher electricity bills, a few $1,000s added to the cost of a new car, and infrastructure projects delayed for reasons unclear. The irony is, the U.S. government expects tariffs to stimulate domestic production, but no refining plant will sprout in a few months, nor will any copper mine reopen with the stroke of a pen. Instead, businesses are forced to downsize, postpone investment plans, or shift orders to countries where copper remains cheap, and, of course, not to America. The copper tariff story, therefore, isn't just about tariffs. It's a sign of an economic policy losing direction, responding to global changes with outdated tools in a world where supply chain cooperation matters more than any national border. When dry numbers begin to affect everyday life, when lamp prices, light switches, and even phone chargers increase by the day, Americans will realize that sometimes decisions that sound patriotic are double-edged swords. And this time, that blade is turning back on the very hand that wields it. Canada strikes back, and a silent breakup. When the U.S. unleashed the tariff blow, many predicted Canada would respond. But no one expected Ottawa to act so quickly and decisively enough to turn what seemed like a passive reaction into a strategic pivot. Within less than a week after Washington imposed a 50% tariff on imported copper, Canada did not hold a major press conference, nor broadcast criticisms on national television. Instead, they pulled the plug. All refined copper export contracts to the U.S., accounting for over 40% of Canada's total production, were frozen. Shipments waiting at ports were held. Trucks en route to smelters in Ohio and Texas were forced to turn back. No shouting was necessary. Canada needed only to act, and that action reverberated louder than any diplomatic declaration. To Canadian politics, known for its calm and caution, this wasn't impulsive. It was strategy, meticulously prepared, based on repeated signals from Washington that trade agreements could be torn up at any time in the name of America First. Thus, when the tariff dropped, Canada did not rage. It took control, not to cause hardship, but because it was time to protect itself from an unreliable partner. The pivot in Ottawa's response lies not in freezing exports, but in opening new doors. Canada didn't just say no to the U.S., it said yes to the rest of the world. The major copper mines in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, once tethered to cross-border logistics, shifted toward the Pacific. Within the first week, mining firms like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals began renegotiating contracts and redirecting raw copper to markets such as Japan, South Korea, and China, where massive refining capacity stood ready to absorb the new supply. This is not just a change of partner, it is a repositioning. Canada, once a material supplier for the U.S., is redefining itself as a strategic resource hub for Asia and Europe. That did not happen by accident. It was backed by a major investment, CAD $1.8 billion, approximately USD $1.3 billion, to expand export infrastructure, build new West Coast transshipment ports, upgrade interprovincial logistics systems, and boost export stockpiles outside North America. Once these routes are complete, Canada won't just avoid U.S. market risk. It will establish a new status. No longer just a delivery partner for its southern neighbor, but a genuine competitor in the global metals value chain. People once thought Canada needed the U.S. to survive in the raw materials market. But this pivot shows the opposite. The U.S. depended on Canada more than it realized. When Canada pulled out of the supply chain, the losers were not Ottawa, but Detroit, Houston, cable factories in Wisconsin, and energy firms in Nevada. The story becomes more profound when examining how Canada struck back. No hostility, no barriers, no tit-for-tat tariffs, but through restructuring, through long-term strategy, through the belief that an open economy with direction is stronger than any isolated protectionist policy. With this shift, Canada is betting on a world not centered on America. And conversely, America is pushing itself away from the most stable economic alliances it once relied on. If the supply chain is a game of trust, it was the U.S. that broke the most valuable piece, and Canada chose not to wait for a reconciliation day. Some may say this is a temporary act of anger. But with Ottawa announcing an export expansion plan over the next 5 years and increasing trade share with Asia, this is no longer a reaction, but the beginning of a new trajectory. No shots were fired, but a silent breakup occurred. And this time, it was not Canada asking to leave, but America, with its unilateral tariff policy that closed the door behind itself. In an increasingly fragmented global trade politics, Canada's move is a silent yet profound declaration. We are no longer a satellite orbiting the U.S. We can set our own trajectory. And for the first time in decades, America may have to get used to being left behind when the supply chain cracks right on U.S. soil. Policy may be signed in Washington, but the consequences hit small factories in Ohio, assembly lines in Michigan, and electronics suppliers in Nevada. After the 50% copper tariff and Canada's strategic counterstrike, the clearest impact wasn't on diplomatic news, but in the stunned eyes of production managers when a shipment ordered last month failed to arrive. And even if it did, the price had already risen to unaffordable levels. The supply chain crisis facing the U.S. is not happening on television. It manifests in unsigned delivery invoices, emergency meetings between CFOs and logistics teams, and emails sent to customers about delayed orders, together forming an undercurrent pushing American industry to the brink of collapse. In industrial regions like Indiana and Pennsylvania, many electrical equipment manufacturers, dependent on imported copper wiring, are seeing cancellations on a scale not seen since the COVID-19 pandemic, not due to lack of demand, but because they cannot promise stable pricing. Copper prices rise daily, sometimes hourly. A spool that cost $180 last year now tops $240, plus shipping and insurance costs soaring with market volatility. The situation is even worse in the electric vehicle, EV industry, the biggest hope for America's energy transition. The average EV uses nearly 80 kilos of copper. That means just this material adds over $800 to each vehicle's production cost, and that figure could more than double given domestic copper price spikes. Tesla, Ford, GM, once hopeful for momentum from climate and clean energy legislation, are now quietly postponing production plans and pausing new assembly projects in the South and West. An anonymous executive at a Texas EV components supplier reported, "We are being forced to choose. Either take losses to retain contracts or break our own supply chain. No one wins here." What's more frightening isn't large corporations, but small and mid-sized businesses. They lack material reserves, financial leverage, and ability to pivot amid sudden shocks. In many areas, electrical panel producers, telecom equipment firms, and consumer component companies have begun laying off staff. Those with state contracts on infrastructure projects are requesting contract renegotiation, citing copper price escalation beyond control. The impact extends to an unexpected sector: electricity utilities. These companies, using copper in transformers, high-voltage lines, and transmission systems, have seen material costs rise between 18% and over 25% within 3 weeks. Some power providers in California and Illinois have filed rate increase requests, citing global metal price volatility beyond corporate control. The issue is no longer who's losing, but the depth and breadth of the damage spreading horizontally, vertically, and deeply. No modern industry operates without copper. From circuit boards in smartphones, to solar panels, to underground cables in skyscrapers, all depend on this red metal. When it becomes scarce, the gears of the economy begin to jam. In an urgent report from UBS, economic experts warn that U.S. GDP could shrink by 0.5 percentage points in the next quarter if shortages and price pressures persist. The red alert is on, and the most alarming truth is not the immediate losses, but the fact that the U.S. lacks domestic refining capacity to replace lost imports. Refineries like Asarco, Arizona, or Kennecott, Utah, already operating below maximum capacity due to high costs, now face pressure to expand production immediately, a near impossible demand in the short term. Meanwhile, copper from Chile and Peru cannot fill Canada's gap due to limited port infrastructure, logistics, and import quotas, many of which were imposed by the very same U.S. administration. A paradox emerges. A policy meant to protect domestic production instead constricts supply, drives up costs, plunges domestic firms into crisis, and forces American consumers to pay the final price through utility bills, rent, car prices, and household goods. Perhaps the most ironic thing in this entire story is not a poorly timed executive order, but that no one in the White House seemed to see the fragile link between Canadian copper mines and the light bulb glowing in an ordinary American kitchen. And now that link is breaking, a crack in the heart of trust. Inside the White House, the press conference ended with hesitant applause. Trump, as usual, declared victory, praised the instant effectiveness of the tariffs, and blamed Canada for all the ripple effects. But outside that room, the market spoke a different language. The Chicago Metals Exchange was glowing red. Production stocks plummeted, and in factories across Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania, states that delivered tight races for him in 2016, hundreds of executives were tearing their hair out, scrambling to handle canceled orders, doubling costs, and facing the inevitable prospect of layoffs. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the concept of economic trust has never been so fragile. This time, it's not broken by a debt bubble, but by the erosion of a rules-based trading order, when policy decisions are replaced by short-term political motives and national interest is redefined with a tweet. In this context, veteran policymakers are now publicly asking a hard question. Is the United States still a trustworthy partner? Canada, responding with calm but cold precision, didn't simply counterattack on tariffs. It began reassessing the entire strategic supply chain it relied on from the U.S., from military equipment and aviation to heavy industrial components. In closed-door strategy sessions, Ottawa's planners started putting new names on the table. Japan, South Korea, the EU, even Mexico, not to replace the U.S. entirely, but to reduce reliance that could be weaponized at any moment. And Canada is not alone. From Berlin to Jakarta, Paris to New Delhi, a silent wave is growing. A plan B for a world where the U.S. is no longer the stable anchor, but a volatile variable. If the post-war era was an age of U.S.-led orders, NATO, WTO, NAFTA, then 2025 marks a new epoch of economic sovereignty defense, where countries learn to survive and thrive without Washington's embrace. Sadly, Americans seem unaware this crack is widening. While the domestic media circles around elections, legal investigations, and cultural conflicts, the rest of the world is shifting. Quietly, resolutely. A few sober voices in Congress and business are starting to warn. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan, described the situation as dangerously invisible. A senior member of the Council on Foreign Relations bluntly stated, "No one wants to move away from America. But when you get slapped in the face too many times, you learn to turn away." And that is the most frightening part. Not just because copper prices are rising or factories may close, but because the United States is losing its most precious asset in global relations: credibility, something that can't be rebuilt with defense budgets or bought with stimulus packages. In modern history, great powers seldom collapse due to a lack of weapons or oil, but because they lose the trust of countries that once stood beside them. If the current administration does not step back, see the consequences of its own tariffs, and short-sighted nationalist messages. America's influence won't fall from one dramatic shock, but from hundreds of small cuts, constant, slow, and irreversible. And when the world turns away, who will turn back? Closed doors in silence. No alarm bells rang, no declarations of severed ties, no maps that suddenly changed color. Yet in Brussels, a closed-door meeting of the European Commission's Trade Committee for the first time removed the United States from the priority list for upcoming FTA negotiations. In Tokyo, the Japanese government quietly signed a memorandum upgrading semiconductor technology cooperation with Australia and Canada, a field that the U.S. once led incontestably. In New Delhi, deliberations over the Asia-Africa Economic Corridor accelerated, with a core principle repeated behind closed doors: not to depend on a partner who can reverse course via a single tweet. A new world is taking shape not through war, but through silence. And in that silence, the United States is gradually being excluded from the decision-making circles it once initiated. In Ottawa, economic experts examined Canada-EU trade figures post-CETA and observed something unprecedented. Canada's trade share with the EU surpassed that with the US for medical equipment and environmental technologies. A small sign, but not random. After shocks from US steel and lumber tariffs, Canadian businesses proactively diversified risk. They didn't wait for America to change. They changed themselves. In Berlin, a senior official from the Ministry of Economic Affairs bluntly stated in an internal forum, "We cannot live indefinitely in uncertainty over the mood of a U.S. president." The remark might sound like investor reassurance, but it reflects an underlying wave of emotion rising: fatigue. And when fatigue exceeds a tolerance threshold, it ceases to be just an emotion. It becomes strategy. In the past, countries could endure blows from America because Washington remained the ultimate safe bet. But now, as the U.S. breaks commitments it once demanded others uphold, from WTO and the Paris Agreement to NAFTA, the residue left isn't power, but doubt. Even the closest allies show signs of drifting. South Korea is turning to ASEAN as an additional shield against instability on the Korean peninsula. Post-Brexit Britain is approaching smaller markets like Vietnam and Kenya to avoid price pressure from both the US and the EU. These moves may seem scattered, but when combined, they form a clear picture. The world is learning to live without America. The irony is that the US still doesn't realize it is being left out of the new play. A superpower that believes no chessboard can unfold without it may soon find that chessboards without it have silently begun. And by the time they realize it, it may already be too late. For nothing is more dangerous than losing a central position without even knowing when you left it. In trade, strategy, and even in the minds of partners. When a knock from Washington no longer lights up meeting halls, when an invitation to negotiate is no longer an honor but a risk, that isn't merely a decline in status. It is a warning. The world is shifting, and any power that fails to heed these silent signals will sooner or later be left behind. Not because it is weak, but because it isolates itself in the illusion that the world still revolves around it. When invisible hands quietly sign. If power has traditionally been expressed through speeches, public agreements, or handshakes in front of the cameras, then in 2025, a different kind of power is quietly rising. The power of nods no one sees, of deals no one announces, and of signatures on internal documents that only a few are allowed to witness. As economies begin to find ways to avoid the U.S., the vacuum Washington leaves behind is not left empty. It is swiftly filled by other hands, but not with guns, armies, or rallying cries, rather with logistics contracts, flights carrying engineers, and wire transfers that make no noise but arrive with steady rhythm. In Abu Dhabi, a state-owned bank of the UAE has quietly signed a credit guarantee deal with Brazil, prioritizing payments in reals and dirhams instead of US dollars. This is not a declaration against the dollar, but it is a small step away from the financial orbit of America. In Johannesburg, a closed-door BRICS Plus summit launched a trial version of an intra-block payment system called Aurum, not to replace SWIFT, but to silently form a parallel path. China doesn't need to declare its intent to dominate the world. All it needs are trans-Asian railways that run on time and containers leaving Haiphong or Mombasa to arrive in Leipzig ahead of schedule. Russia doesn't need to claim geopolitical victories. It only needs to ensure its oil flows to India without disruption, and that partners need not worry about legal risks when using rubles. Meanwhile, the U.S. is still busy debating whether to continue funding allies or withdraw troops from outdated bases. They're still meeting, still talking about global leadership. But when those meetings end, few bring home draft plans to revise and turn into action. Because decisions now aren't shaped where the lights shine bright, but where they no longer reach. In Singapore, international logistics experts are reconfiguring trade infrastructure through the Strait of Malacca, no longer routing major transshipment through Los Angeles, but steering toward Vancouver and Mexican ports as the new hubs. A frown from the logistics sector can now affect the entire supply chain of Ohio or Texas, but America is no longer the default endpoint. And this is the most dangerous part. Partners are no longer blaming or protesting the U.S. They just move on without waiting. When people no longer expect anything from a superpower, no longer feel anger when left behind, but simply stop including it in strategic maps, that is the clearest sign of a retreat in credibility. Not by collapse, but by fading into irrelevance. In the post-old globalization world, the U.S. is no longer the scriptwriter. It's invited to play supporting roles, if lucky, and in some scenes it's not even named. When invisible hands quietly sign, the future gets decided without applause, and without the consent of a superpower long used to being the center of the stage. This shift is not loud, but it is irreversible. Because once the world learns how to sign contracts without America, it will also learn how to build a new world without America at the center, when allies are no longer unconditional supporters. There was a time when people used to say, if you're a friend of America, you'll never be alone. But by 2025, many long-standing allies are beginning to wonder, could being alone perhaps be the less risky path? Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, nations that once formed the pillars of a U.S.-led world order, are now engaging in conversations that, just a few years ago, would have been considered heresy. In Tokyo, an internal government report analyzed the feasibility of upgrading independent defense systems, gradually reducing reliance on America's nuclear umbrella. In Berlin, for the first time in decades, a senior advisor in Parliament publicly stated, "We can't keep sitting around waiting for Washington to make a decision." And the reason for this shift didn't come from a single event, but from a long string of accumulated disappointments. Afghanistan, Ukraine, the South China Sea, NATO. One by one, America either withdrew, hesitated, or prioritized domestic interests over global commitments, leaving behind a vacuum no one is certain they will return to fill. That disappointment over time stopped being anger and turned into a kind of cold default, that the U.S. is no longer the foundation on which to bet the future, no longer the center to orbit around, and most importantly, no longer an unconditional protector. In a closed-door meeting in Brussels, European diplomats for the first time brought up the concept of comprehensive strategic autonomy without attaching the phrase "in cooperation with the U.S." In Seoul, the government began testing risk scenarios in case of an unexpected American troop withdrawal. Those scenarios were once reserved for worst-case situations. Now, they're mandatory content in annual defense planning documents. But perhaps the clearest illustration of this fracture came from a seemingly minor event: the Munich Security Conference earlier this year. When the U.S. delegation arrived nearly 2 hours late due to the president being caught up in budget debates in Congress, not a single person voiced objection. Not out of sympathy, but because expectations no longer existed. The most anticipated speech of that conference was not from the U.S., but from the president of the EU Commission. And that speech ended with prolonged applause, while the American representative sat in the back, silent. The world once believed that without America, chaos would come. But now many are thinking the opposite. Perhaps it's precisely because America is so unpredictable that a new order must be built without depending on it. What's frightening isn't betrayal by allies. It's when those who once stood shoulder to shoulder begin planning for a life without America. They don't break alliances, don't declare withdrawal from agreements. They simply start designing new circles in which the U.S. is no longer the center, and sometimes not even on the map. Like satellites strong enough to orbit on their own, the world is gradually breaking free from the gravitational pull of a once indispensable superpower. And when old allies begin to act not out of consensus, but out of the need for independent survival, that's when credibility is no longer an asset, but merely a memory. In that memory, America once stood at the center, tall, bright, powerful. But in the new reality, it stands on the sidelines, and no one waits for it anymore.